Good evening. Thank you for joining us today in the Public Facilities Arts and Culture Committee of the Metro Council. Today is Thursday, May 5th. It is almost 5 o'clock. We have one item on the agenda. So let me first take roles. Myself, Bradford, Councilmember Henderson, Councilmember Nash, Councilmember Taylor, Councilmember Young. That is a quorum. So we have RS 2022-1507, O'Connell, Allen, and Withers. It approves an option agreement between the Metropolitan Government and the State of Tennessee authorizing the purchase of property located at 88 Hermitage Avenue. Do I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
Okay. And discussion.
I would just be interested to hear from Councilman O'Connell about.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So colleagues might remember that we tried to acquire this land for approximately half the price last term. We were unsuccessful in that. Nonetheless, I think the location of the land situated between some MDHA parcels and a prospective park at Wharf Park still makes it a strategically valuable acquisition. We'll leave it up to the committee discussion. Obviously, we'll have some discussion in the body about whether the value still justifies it. I always prefer to buy land when it's cheaper, but I will let the committee discuss.
I appreciate you bringing up the cost and everything. So I had a couple questions jotted down. I know that there was an attempt last term to purchase this property. How much was it then, and how much are we paying now?
I believe it was, and we will look at the appraisals, I think it was about $11 million last term, and Mr. Jameson can speak to this, but I think the appraisal puts it at just over 20 now, and so we are not paying much over the appraised value, but it is a substantial increase in just a few years.
And why didn't we not purchase it last year when it was cheap, or the last term when it was cheaper?
The discussion in council at that time was primarily devoted to the structure that is on the site at 88 Hermitage Avenue is an old School for the Blind building, which I have toured. It does seem suitable for a potential adaptive reuse opportunity, but I think there were some council members who were persuaded that the Metro School's proposal to create a Nashville School of the Arts campus there was not sufficiently attentive to the cause of preservation, and they were not successful in persuading the council as a whole that the land purchase should have gone forward. I mean, again, I think still the principle of bringing the land into Metro from the state of Tennessee, who currently own it, was still valuable, even if there was not consensus that that use was good. And so we're a little bit correcting what I consider to be a past mistake, but again, I think this is good land for Metro to own.
Correcting a mistake at twice the value. Councilmember Nash.
Would it be also fair to say that the financial situation of the city is drastically different than it was 4 years ago, too, with respect to picking up these kinds of land purchases?
Maybe, but we had the capital allocated for it, right? As in we were not going to miss the opportunity just because of the financial situation, right? I mean, there were many conversations over the past few years over which land we're selling for how much, the process for that, and then the appraisal scenario for public land, but also which land we might ought to acquire.
I think it offers a great opportunity for some green space.
So do we have a prospective use of this land?
I am aware of, I would say, some concepts, but I would defer to the administration on the full picture of use. I would not expect that this parcel would be exclusively green space. So, but I would defer to the administration.
Well, Mr. Jameson?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councilor Hurt. We have some representatives from Metropolitan Nation here with us today that can speak a bit more thoroughly to this, but they envision a master planning process that would determine the highest and best uses for it. Particular discussions have centered around the fact that there is a homeless encampment there that we have to be sensitive to. It is in a floodplain, and for those who remember the 2010 flood, it was completely wiped out, so that has to be carefully attended. We now have, unfortunately, new state legislation that the governor has allowed to go into effect that criminalizes the encampment for all intents and purposes. So that has to be addressed. Parks Department has made clear that they're more than willing to refrain from any immediate development action until that is addressed appropriately. I don't know if Mr. Nate or Harrison would want to add to that.
I do have a just quick point of clarification. 88 Hermitage itself is up high. There is also the Wharf Park site down low. 88 Hermitage, I don't believe, is floodplain.
Right, that was my question, Mr. Jameson. I mean, my perception of that is it's high up on the,
Oh, it is, yeah, it's a 50-foot bluff between the two.
okay, so, but the parcel itself goes all the way down?
No, it was the homeless encampment that was.
The encampment is actually not on 88 Hermitage.
Okay, so in the criminalization of the homeless encampment, that's a made homeless encampment, not one that could be orchestrated and produced and maintained by the city. That would be something different. I mean, I understand people just coming in and squatting and making their own home out of it. But if we created a place for the homeless and made it something nice and doable and serving a population of people that we need, having our own safety net for those individuals, that's not criminalization of those, would it be?
That is my understanding. I am.
So any homeless encampment would be criminalization.
So my understanding of state law is that previously federal and state properties were included. Now it's any public properties, including Metro-owned properties. But if we specifically set it aside for that use, does that get us out from underneath the state law? That was my understanding the first time I looked at the legislation. I haven't looked at it since it went into effect 48 hours ago.
So my question is, why is this coming back up now? So if the state of Tennessee owns it, we own an adjacent major parcel for purposes of Wharf Park, and MDHA is on the other side. And it's a triangle of sorts up on the top, and there is the old School of the Blind. What has precipitated this other than, oh wow, real estate values are going up and up and up and up? What do we contemplate there? Because to Councilman O'Connell's first, what he was sharing earlier, I think there was concern more specifically because, School of the Arts, great, but what does that mean for the older structure? I mean, do we contemplate that it will just be incorporated into the park for some potential civic use? Did the Plan to Play master plan ever contemplate that? I mean, I think I become concerned sometimes when things feel disconnected from our larger plans. And so if you could just contextualize it maybe a little bit more.
I don't know where the administration's final perspective is on this. I do think important considerations are if preservation is one of the reasons we did not acquire this parcel last time, we should ask, do we intend to preserve now, right? We have a substantial area already allocated for the park. I think this is an appropriate node to offer housing, potentially specifically for people who are currently unhoused and or affordable. And this has come up, at least conceptually, in other nearby conversations, such as when we received money as a voluntary contribution from nearby redevelopment proposals, right? So we really should understand, what do we intend to do with that? I mean, it's fine to master plan it, but I do think the notion of concepts for the land. I will say, I think that we need to do on this higher site something other than just a pure green space with maybe a community center in the old preserved building, right? I think there is developable land there. We have a crucial need for housing. It could be an important way to kind of recognize the plight of people who have been on that lower portion and now potentially displaced twice. So there are some opportunities, but we need to have that conversation.
Councilor, if I may, just because my initial question did not get addressed, I know there was two questions kind of within the question, but why now? So if the state of Tennessee owns it, is the state of Tennessee approached the city of Nashville and said, hey, we really want to sell this, we want to give you kind of right of first refusal, or what's happening there?
Right, so as I recall, that when this was last surfaced in 2019, the two frustrating issues, I think, for both proponents and opponents was the MNPS plan. the ordinance was drafted so that it was a purchase on behalf of MNPS. Once that acquisition is made, schools is in total control. We do not control and cannot dictate to them how they develop the land that we provide to them. Mr. Profit was summoned to a committee meeting like this. There were letters submitted by co-sponsor and then Councilmember Fabian Bettany, an architect, saying, can you promise not to destroy the building? And the ultimate answer was no, and that the intention was to tear down and cart it away. What was emerging at the same time for council members was, it was known it had some historic significance, but the amount of significance continues to evolve. It now appears that this was not just the last lingering structure of a segregated disability home in the city, but in the state and probably the nation. This has national significance, and it is important that it be adaptively reused and preserved. So that is objective one. The master plan around it, there are 3 lots with MDHA and state ownership involved, but their appraisal, the other concern was deep rightful concern that the state was tired of deferring this and was about to sell it to a private developer. And we knew that they had interest. They were willing to do an appraisal. They did. We're acquiring it for that appraisal price. I suspect we're still getting a deal because you know what property values are in exceeding appraisals. But Councilman Bedney wrote a letter immediately after the last bill and asked for an extension. It was granted. They now have the appraisal and we now have the opportunity. So that's.
I appreciate that, thank
Can
you.
I ask, are you clarifying that the administration intends specifically to preserve the building?
Yes, that is an objective for the mayor, because this is, the building itself, the bones, as they say, are in good condition. It is worth preservation and
Councilmember
adaptive reuse.
That was the reason why I was asking what was the prospective intent of it, because wondering if it could be leased by the state, if the city could lease it from the state, or are they in the business of selling it, and for what purpose, in order for us to, yes.
Councilmember Harry, I can speak a little bit to this, not in the specifics, but I will tell you, I was at a recent presentation by the Commissioner of General Services for the state of Tennessee. She gave a pretty broad overview of they have a strategic real estate plan, and it is coupled with their overall plan for workforce, that they are intentionally disposing of several real estate sites that are either unused or, like in this case, have maybe a structure. But for instance, the tornado destroyed the DCS facility, or Department of Human Services facility down on 2nd Avenue North. They sold that. They sold it to a private developer. I suspect they would also prefer to dispose of this land.
All right, any other questions on this?
Is there a timeline with this that we have to make the decision right away? Are we pending grant funding or something that we got to do it right now, or?
We have already allocated capital for this land, so this is actually just exercising the agreement. It's to Councilmember Nash's point, last time it's two-step process, right? You have to have the money, and then you have to actually exercise the purchase. So we have allocated the money and capital already. So this is now just it's not like there's not funding that is tied to the timeline except that it is already allocated capital.
Councilmember Henderson?
I guess my last question is, I appreciate that this site was specifically identified, we had already allocated, it is more at this time. But, I've always wondered if we're getting kind of the right balance of having kind of opportunistic funds, right? Like when we have an opportunity like this, it's strategic, it's next to a park, et cetera, and having enough kind of sitting there to do that in this real estate market increasingly difficult, and also just kind of like long-range strategic planning for like land banking and so forth, because I feel like in the last few years or in our term, we've had a big bend in the river that a whole lot of the environmental community felt like we should acquire. But then we're hearing from the park side of things like, can we please stop banking all this land because we can't maintain it? I know different type land has different maintenance issues, but I have somewhat lost kind of the through line from a parks perspective of, how much money is in the bucket for long-range strategic goals and how those are prioritized. How much is in a bucket for an opportunistic type thing like this? So I don't know if Mr. Nate, can you speak to, just from a kind of a master planning perspective, if you think about, what does that bucket look like for you all? And if, aside from this kind of coming up as an opportunity, I mean, do you all have a longer list of things that are bigger priorities? And so I guess I just wonder, Mr. Jameson, yes, in a former CSP, we identified this site. Now the state wants to get rid of it. It's only going to get more expensive, but it's still $20 million. And is there some other thing in parks master planning that they would rather put $20 million to? Because just because we've appropriated it doesn't mean we have to spend it, right? We could put it back in the bigger bucket of strategic land acquisition for actual vetted, spent time. These are the things that we want. So, Mr. Nate, can you speak to that?
Well, I would defer to Cindy as Greenways and Open Space
I apologize, Ms. Harrison.
division head,
Either
and
way.
I'm happy to chime in.
Yeah, we'll tag team it because we both, our interest or what we do overlaps, certainly. So there's rarely property that just sits for a long time on the market.
Right.
And we certainly have areas in the county identified in plan to play where there's deficit
Right.
recreation. So, I mean, just today we were looking at prioritizing areas where there is a deficit. It doesn't mean the property is there, available. And since we don't condemn or do eminent domain, we don't force property to be available. We look in those areas and we keep watch. Right now, council allocated $2 million in the last capital spending plan for open space. So it varies. If we know that there is, if the timing works out where we realize there's an acquisition, that could be a possibility and it happens at capital budget time, then it's easy to identify that amount of money. But it has varied over the years on how much has just been given for those opportunities.
How much do you have now that's allocated that's unassigned? That's just for a strategic
So
opportunity or a priority?
We have dipped into that 2 million, and I'll have to get back to you with the exact number, but we have, we're finishing up the Tusculum Road, we close on that 10 acres on Monday. We were looking at Lachlan Springs, we're looking at, I'm gonna blank on it now. We have 4 properties in the works, but it doesn't use up all of that 2 million. And then the 20 million for this was a separate, completely allocated just for that project. I don't think we would have been allocated $20 million for land banking.
Okay, so
that-
you
that
don't
would
have
be
a
large
strategic kind of,
Undesignated purpose.
Yeah,
for, okay,
that would have been a large allocation.
got it, thank you.
So I have a question, getting it back to the parks and the open spaces. So is parks and open space basically a catch-all whenever we acquire property that we're not going to be doing anything with immediately? We buy it, then it goes to parks and open space until we decide we're going to turn into housing or a police station or a fire hall, et cetera.
We acquire it for parks.
Okay. So, a question,
just
Mr.
public
Jameson,
property.
when we do acquire, like, where does that property sit? Like, who manages, who maintains it if it's not parks or open space?
Typically, it's assigned to the department that would be the ultimate intended use, and so often open space does relay itself to parks. The Parks Department very rightfully often responds that they would not have the manpower or personnel or resources to implement, and it'll just sit there, and so do you really want to purchase at this time, sort of understanding. In this particular instance, because of the Wharf Park advancement, I don't want to speak for Cindy, but I think there's interest on the part of parks in the acquisition.
Councilman Collins?
There's a related question. So you're saying that this would not just be maintained through our overall portfolio of public property, but rather specifically assigned to parks?
It's my well, I would defer to
I might
Cindy.
chime in on just generally on the status of the Wharf Park Master Plan, which we've been working on now for nearly a year, but in June, we will be going to the public with the third round of concepts for third and near final concepts for the Park Master Plan. knowing that this has been funded, and that there has been discussion about it, we're prepared to incorporate portions of the 88 Hermitage site into our overall master plan, and we've taken that into consideration. What 88 Hermitage offers to Wharf Park is an ability to have a presence on Hermitage Avenue. A significant portion of the site is undeveloped currently, which would lend itself to neighborhood scale park improvements and recreational amenities at that same level as Hermitage Avenue and Rolling Mill Hill and the other Napier, Sudicum, the other residential areas that are growing. So there's a lot of advantage to adding 88 Hermitage to Wharf Park. There is also potential for multifamily, a multifamily housing pad or on the site possibly, and then whatever entity ends up owning or being responsible for the school for the blind, I think would be to be determined. But a significant portion of the site, we would be anticipating, we would hope would be added to considered parkland.
And is it feasible, I apologize.
Oh, go ahead.
Is it feasible for that to be some level of community center that it's administered by parks? I mean, I don't know the size of the building. Mr. Jameson said it's got good bones, so to speak, but if that's going, I mean, I think what I hear you saying is, because I'm like, where is Wharf Park? You know, like it's sort of, like it's down
Yeah, it
there.
has no-
That it can kind of be a front door to that park, but because of its adjacencies, it has some potential, whether it be MDHA from a housing perspective or, community center, parks center, something.
The building is approximately 40,000 square feet, which
Okay.
is big.
Yeah.
What you see from the street is the main level, but there's at least half of the lower level,
Okay.
because of the slope of the site,
Interesting. Okay.
is habitable and has good daylighting and is
Okay.
usable space. And I think some might look at that building and be very concerned about its condition. My background is in historic preservation. I look at it and think, well, it looks pretty good.
Okay.
But I don't believe there's been an assessment of what the costs would be associated with rehab of that building, regardless of what use might go in it.
Okay.
Did you have anything to add?
Right, so again, having toured it, I think, both Mr. Jameson and Mr. Nate are correct that it is a building absolutely suitable for adaptive reuse, but it is going to need renovation.
Right. Which
So,
would be
the
beyond
additional
this,
capital
right,
cost.
right.
All right, is there any other discussion on this? All right, I will go ahead then and take the vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any against? All right, Mr. Young is not here, so the vote is 5 in favor, none against. And with that, we are adjourned.
Chair, I'm sorry, I didn't